Hi friends, I'm Scott Giles and welcome to Saturday at 2:30. Every Saturday at 2:30, I do a podcast here on Facebook Live and which I will then edit and put up on my YouTube channel and also distribute to my patrons who subscribe to me on my Patreon channel. I touch upon some aspect of life coaching because I'm a life coach, or consulting hypnotism because I'm a consulting hypnotist, or spirituality because I am a fully credentialed clergyman. Today I want to talk about skepticism. Now, this is part of a series of podcasts that I'm doing here. Last week I talked about Epicureanism and ancient Greek philosophy. Today I'm talking about skepticism, which is also an ancient Greek philosophy. Next week I'll be talking about Stoicism, a third ancient Greek philosophy, and all three of these philosophies overlap, and I think in a very helpful way. And then I'll do a final podcast putting all three together. So, skepticism. This is where we get our word. I'm skeptical. I'm not sure that something is true. The Greek philosophy of skepticism is based on the proposition that we really don't know anywhere near as much as we think we know. Certain things are true by definition. They can be known absolutely because they are purely matters of definition. For example, I know a circle has 360 degrees because we define it as so. In fact, most of mathematics is a series of definitions and definitions about how other definitions fit together. That can be known absolutely because it is purely something that we create by an action in our mind. However, everything else we should have some degree of skeptical doubt about. Now, when I say this, I don't mean a lack of knowledge. There are presumably a finite number of fish in the sea. I have no idea what that number is. I lack that knowledge. I could give you an estimate, but that's not knowledge. That's not what skepticism is about. Skepticism is about believing that your knowledge is inalterably correct. And it almost never is, unless it concerns a matter of pure definition. For example, I believe the sun will rise tomorrow. Do I know the sun will rise tomorrow? No, I don't. And I won't know that until tomorrow. It's possible that in the course of the evening, the sun could become a supernova and go out, in which case it will not be rising, and the Earth would probably not even still be here. But because that's possible, even if not likely, I don't have knowledge that the sun will rise tomorrow. I have belief. This is what the skeptics call the problem of criterion. When you're dealing with anything other than a pure definition, you can never really know enough to be absolutely sure that what you think you know is true. Another problem we have is what they call the problem of induction. Where do you get your general rules and ideas from? Because you can't be sure that something is universally true just by observing a lot of specific instances, because you could always be mistaken. For example, imagine that as I went through my life, I saw a whole bunch of swans, and in every setting where I saw a swan, it was white. So I assert a general rule: swans are white birds. And then someday someone comes along and says, here's a black swan. Well, all of a sudden, that general rule that I had formulated based upon thousands of individual observations has received a counterexample. It's not true. So we can never know enough to think that we're sure that what we know is the case. Someone can always come along and show us a black swan, or it could turn out that what we believe to be true really isn't, because a counterexample, however unexpected, emerges. And playing probability games, which a lot of physicists like to do when confronted by the philosophy of skepticism, doesn't really help you. Yeah, I can compute the probability that the sun will rise tomorrow, but that computation could be mistaken. And I can reconfirm it by another computation based upon similar data, but that computation could also be mistaken. And on and on and on to an infinite regress. And you could even go one level deeper. And some contemporary philosophers are actually playing with this idea as kind of a mind game. What if nothing's real? What if we're all actually living in a computer simulation and we're all just, in your Nintendo or Sunny console in the sky somewhere? Well, that movie, The Matrix from 1999 by the Wachowskis, that we're all in a magnificent computer simulation and we have no idea. Well, if we were, how would we know? Assuming no one comes along and offers you a red pill that gets you out of that. If we're actually all in such a simulation, nothing we believe is true. Nothing we believe is real is actually real. Philosophers, and my first 2 degrees are in philosophy. As you go to get your degree, you ultimately have to be able to work something called Godels Proof. And Gödel was a mathematician, and what he proved is that in any system of propositions, like a mathematical system, calculus, geometry, trigonometry, no system of propositions can simultaneously be complete and consistent. That's puzzling. Let me unpack it a bit. If it's complete, if everything is all wound up and there are no loose ends, Gödel proved that you will be able to find a contradiction in that system. And if the system is consistent, that is, there are no contradictions, somewhere you're going to find an incompleteness. Somehow that system gets started by something given to it from without, what mathematicians call a given. And that has to be accepted on faith, and then you go from there and you get the entire system, which may be consistent, but it's not going to be complete, because there's that first thing which was given and can't be explained in terms of the system. This probably sounds more complicated than it actually is. If you're curious of knowing more, there's a wonderful book called Gödel, Escher, and Bach by Douglas Hofstadter. I really recommend it, because what Gödel proved in mathematics, Bach demonstrated in music, and Escher demonstrated in art. Nothing is ever complete and consistent. Everything requires an assumption that gets things started. And this gets to what the ancient Greek philosophers were pushing. We get the word skepticism from Pyrrho of Elis in the 4th century before the Common Era. In fact, originally it was called Pyrrhoism, but the name has come to be skepticism. We know most of it by one of his students, Sextus Empiricus, and we get our term empirical, meaning observable, from him. And it's kind of interesting also to know, if you're interested in the history of ideas and comparative religion, that Empiricus knew all about Buddhism. Most people don't realize that in that time, Buddhist missionaries were all over the world. And he did learn some Buddhist concepts, which seem to show up in both Epicureanism, skepticism, and Stoicism. Well, what the skeptics did is they made a distinction between 2 things. First, fantasy, where we get our word fantasy, although that isn't quite what they mean. Your fantasy is the kind of the precognitive belief that you have about what you're observing. It's always a matter of sense data. It's true in the sense that you are observing it, but it could be mistaken. For example, imagine I had a blue ball in my hand. I could truthfully say, I see a blue ball, and that is true. I do see a blue ball. However, I cannot go from that to saying I have a blue ball in my hand because I could be mistaken. It could be a white ball with a blue light on it. I could suddenly have acquired red-blue color blindness. I might be hallucinating. So fantasy is what your sense data gives you, usually pretty reliable, but not 100%. The example often given in classical philosophy is looking at the colors in a pigeon's neck as the light is refracted over the feathers. Well, you truthfully do see colors in a pigeon's neck, but they're not really there. It's a trick of the light. It's an optical illusion. So the role of science is to help us distinguish between the fantasies that are reliable and those that are purely illusion, like the color in a pigeon's neck. But that's where we start. Fantasy, direct sense experience. It's much more likely to be reliable than not, although it can be unreliable. The second thing they call doxa. Doxa are your opinions about your sense experience. And their point was it's your doxa, your opinions, that get you in trouble. That's what often causes you to be wildly unhappy, because your doxa can be wildly inaccurate. I observe, fantasy, my parents avoiding me. I create an opinion about that, doxa, I'm unlovable. I observe my spouse looking at someone else. And I create an opinion about that fantasy, the observation, that he or she doesn't love me, doxa. May be true, but it may not be. I observe my checking account balance is overdrawn, fantasy. And from that I get an opinion, I'm a failure. Now, maybe I am, but maybe that could be reversed, or maybe it's not true that I'm a failure at all. Doxa, your opinions about what you observe are frequently mistaken. One of the nice things about hypnotism is that it can correct that process. We can get information into the mind that causes a reevaluation of those opinions, but that's for another talk. So what the skeptics would say is, trust your sense data, but verify it with science because it could be mistaken. And always realize that your opinions about that sense data, are potentially flawed. Never mistake opinion for knowledge. And never think that your knowledge is absolute, because you could always be mistaken. The problem of criterion and the problem of induction. Now, some of the problems we're seeing in our society right now, like the QAnon conspiracy theory that's out there, people convinced that there are these satanic pedophiles in our government and so on, they got there. That's all opinion. They got there by making interpretations about some of their fantasy, their experiences. They saw some things happening in the world, and they came up with some opinions about that. And what they failed is the skeptical test. They assumed that their opinions were true. They didn't question their observations, and they kept building on opinion after opinion after opinion until finally they're completely detached from the reality that the rest of us share, to our peril. In philosophy classes, sometimes you'll find a student who will say, "Oh, well, it's true for me," when challenged about a belief. And of course, that's nonsense. Nothing can be true for just one person. Or we'll say in religious circles, someone will say, I know that Jesus Christ is my Lord and Savior. And the answer you got to give is no, you don't. What you have is a sincere and strongly held belief, but you do not have knowledge. That's the skeptical doubt that gets in. And the skeptical doubt keeps you humble. There's a verse from in the first book of Thessalonians, chapter 5, verse 21. Prove all things, hold fast to that which is good. This captures the essence of the skeptical philosophy, and the people who wrote the New Testament knew all about Greek philosophy. Prove. Don't assume your observations or your opinions are correct. Always allow for correction or change. Don't mistake knowledge and opinion. They're different. And knowledge is a lot harder to come by, and even then is always to some degree conditional. Hold fast to that which is good. Do more of what seems to work, but always understand that correction may be necessary. And the advantage of following the skeptical philosophy of proving all things and holding fast to that which is good, which, as I've just demonstrated, is actually consistent with the New Testament, not only will you tend to do the things that work, but you'll keep revising and improving your understanding of them because you're not mistaking opinion for knowledge and never thinking that your knowledge, no matter how well established, is ever completely absolute. That will keep you humble, and that will keep your ego under control. And I give you my word, you're going to end up in a better place if you do that. Some of you may have seen the logo that we have on our stationery here at my practice. It's a Celtic cross using a kind of a Celtic knot motif. And alongside of it, there are these two linear structures. Those are oan. In the first century, when paper was expensive and ink was expensive, people learned an alphabet that was made by cross-hatching vertical lines, because there was plenty of wood around and everyone carried a knife. So sometimes they're called, Celtic runes. Not really, but that's what they're called. The same sort of thing. It's a simple alphabet that's easy to carve. And the OM you see in my logo spell out two words: hold fast, because of my embrace of precisely that verse in Thessalonians. Prove all things, hold fast to that which is good. And that is the wisdom of the skeptical philosophy. And if you accept that wisdom, you're going to wind up in a better place than if you don't. Hey, thank you for your time and attention today. I'll be back next week talking about Stoicism, the first of the ancient three Greek philosophies that I think are enormously helpful in a practical way, and then I'll be putting all of them together. So check back if you're curious. If I can be of help to you, please fill out to reach out through my Patreon channel or my website. If you're watching this video on social networking, please like, subscribe, and share. It does help me if you share my videos, so please do that. Take care, stay well, and stay safe.